Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you all for being here for our very last plenary session, those in the room and those on our live stream. A quick programming update, if you're still looking at your programs, Zainab Usman from the Carnegie Endowment was unable to join us this morning. She has an illness and she sends her regrets. And so we are deeply indebted to Maya Sparkman from the Atlantic Council for taking Zainab's place on the panel. So please join me in welcoming Maya and the rest of the panel to the stage.
I'm Amanda Glassman, and I am the Executive Vice President and a Senior Fellow at a think tank, an independent, nonpartisan think tank called the Center for Global Development. I'm really honored to be here with you today, learning from all of you and from my co-panelists. Our session aims to go global on the abundance agenda. Our focus is on energy and food security. But what does this really mean in a world that has huge disparities? And I mean, even during the COVID-19 period, in most countries, there's been a huge reversal of fortunes in human development and even in life expectancy in our own country. So first, there are huge inequalities. As my colleague Todd Moss has pointed out, my refrigerator uses more energy in a year than an individual in most sub-Saharan African countries, despite the importance of energy for prosperity, for survival. 733 million people have no access to electricity at all. 77% of them live in sub-Saharan Africa. And likewise, more than 2 billion people were food insecure in 2020, and 20% of kids experienced stunting, low height for age. There were food supply problems because of the war in Ukraine and COVID-19 disruptions, but there were also availability and access problems in countries that was due to inflation, but also just the structural features of the way agriculture operates in those countries. Extreme poverty, which is the world's least ambitious global target, $1.90 a day pre-COVID-19, has been declining over time really dramatically. Only 9% of people today live in extreme poverty. But still, our World in Data finds that 85% of the world still earns below the Swedish poverty line, if that's our more ambitious aspiration. We know progress is possible when safe and cost-effective technologies are accessible and usable. I'm a global health person, and I think the sector provides some examples and inspiration for our conversation on energy and food security. Just a few generations ago, about half of children died before puberty. And today, in the country with the highest mortality in the world, in Somalia, only about 14% of kids die. So even the very worst off places are so much better off than in the past. And why is that? Because of the diffusion and adoption of transformational technologies, like vaccines, also sanitation, but technology and medical technology has a huge role to play. And that access was historically helped and facilitated by rich country government and individuals' own adoption in our own countries, so we were living the example, as well as in our external policies and efforts. Our session is going to explore the opposite issue, how rich country governments' policies, regulations, and societal attitudes may be stymieing progress and access to safe and cost-effective technologies in the rest of the world, and slowing or preventing progress towards a more abundant future. There are a couple of examples. As countries struggle with gas shortages, high prices, financing for nuclear energy production, clean, safe, and scalable, is not permitted at the World Bank or other multilateral development bank, and these are principal sources of external finance to low and middle income countries. Why? Because a vocal group of anti-nuclear countries from Austria to New Zealand have kept financing off the table for decades. Likewise, hydropower and gas projects, despite being net cleaner, have been totally off the table and not even discussed in analytics and policy dialogue. A second example is worrying about unproven or mitigatable safety risks. Buoyed by sentiment about organic farming, many countries ban or limit synthetic fertilizers and pesticides that are important for yields and food security. We just saw the example of a seed that could increase yield by an enormous amount. But if no one adopts it, it doesn't deliver on its potential benefits. In Sri Lanka, I was reading the BTI journal. They mentioned that a ban contributed to a fall in crop yield of about 30 to 50%. in the midst of all the other shocks that were going on. It's truly surprising. And finally, it's not just in energy and food security. Because I'm a global health person, I have to mention, anti-vaccine disinformation has limited the uptake of COVID-19 vaccines here in the United States. And we've seen 76%, an NBR paper came out yesterday showing that counties that were predominantly Republican experienced 76% more excess deaths post-vaccine due to COVID-19. This is a failure to adopt. So we're literally killing people even though we have safe technology available. And worse, those ideas and this disinformation and this anti-science is affecting the adoption of existing effective childhood vaccines that have spillovers around the world, because we can't just respond to an infectious disease in New York City with a polio outbreak, but what happens everywhere. We're seeing measles outbreaks for the first time in countries like Zimbabwe, again, after having almost eliminated. I think each of these examples illustrates a failure to assess and communicate the benefits and costs of the use of these technologies in net terms, as well as a tendency to make policy and individual choices based on sentiment and often disinformation. There has been a near absence of sustained advocacy in favor of the science and evidence behind key green, ag, and health technologies, although this is starting to change, I think, with your own and allied movements. And then there's the simple hypocrisy of deploying so many of these technologies at home, but then opposing their uptake in the poorest countries of the world, all while allowing China and Russia to become the financier or advisor of choice, because they are willing to engage in the discussion on nuclear power plants with low and middle income countries. And in so doing, we get to the topic of our session. We're pulling up the ladder. We're sacrificing huge potential gains in our own and global well-being, even though we know that the world economy needs to increase fivefold for global poverty to substantially decline, and we know this must happen in ways that protect our climate and planet. Adoption of safe and cost-effective technologies is one of the only ways to get this right. So the question is the current crisis in energy and in food and in health a chance to shift our dysfunctional politics in these spaces? And today our panelists are going to explore those issues. We'll start with Maya Sparkman, who very kindly is sitting in for Zainab Osman, the great Zainab Osman. And she'll take a look at energy poverty in Africa and the current debate on energy access and its intersection with climate goals in the region. She'll be followed by Robert Paarlberg, who's from the Harvard Kennedy School, and I just saw his article in the BTI Journal, who will look at how high-income country green movements are affecting farmers and food security in sub-Saharan Africa. And finally, but not least, Shayak Sengupta from ORF America, who will look at the issues in energy and climate policy between the US and India, as well as nuclear energy and climate finance more generally. So with that, I'll turn it over to you in that order. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda. And it is a true pleasure for me to be here. My name is Maya Sparkman. I've gotten 2 introductions already, so I'll introduce myself a third time. And I'm currently an assistant director at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. I first wanted to thank the Breakthrough Institute for taking a chance on me, Alex, coming up to me yesterday and introducing himself and then asking me to be on the panel. So here I am, and I am going to do my very best to fill in for Zainab. She is incredibly talented and a seasoned expert on these topics, and so I will try my best to fill in for her skills, expertise, and background, but just be easy on me during the Q&A part. And so the panels that have gone before me, too, I wanted to thank those panelists as well, because I've learned so much about permitting reform and the YIMBY movement and abolishing NEPA, and I guess we don't give a shit about spotted toads anymore. So
I still like the toads.
Okay, so we're indifferent about where we're going forward with the toads. But yeah, so I'll just dive right in. I was actually just in Cape Town last week attending a conference, and Zainab was actually there. So I had the privilege of hearing her speak on a couple panels, and now you guys are missing out on that privilege, and you have to hear me speak. But we were attending this conference hosted by the African Climate Foundation and the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa to learn about South Africa's just energy transition and their just energy transition partnership, which was negotiated between 5 G7 countries and announced last year at COP. I won't get into too much of the details, but it's, in essence, a coal decommissioning partnership for South Africa to make that just energy transition and deploy renewables at scale. And so we were at this beautiful hotel, sitting around, having dinner at a table, and really engaging in really rich discussions about these opportunities to secure a more sustainable energy future for South Africa. And then the lights went off. And load shedding kicked in. And this is something that here at this conference we haven't had to experience. We're not concerned. The tech folks over there aren't concerned that load shedding is going to kick in and everything's going to cut out and we have to wait 30 seconds for the hotel generator to kick in. And I think this is a privilege that we have grown accustomed to here in the States, but also a reality that South Africans are faced on a daily basis of experiencing blackouts for 2, 4, 6, 8 hours in a day. And this is in South Africa, which has one of the more developed energy infrastructure systems compared to the rest of the African continent. And so Eskom, the utility company, is nice enough to distribute a schedule of when to expect those blackouts. And load shedding, I don't know if folks are familiar, but load shedding is when utility companies shut out power because the demand is greater than the primary supply source. And so we were experiencing this challenge. It created a good dinner topic of conversation, but then it was a reality check, a small example, but a stark reality of these challenges that South Africa faces in their energy transition. And this isn't even compared to what the rest of the continent struggles with over half of the population lacking access to energy. They don't even get to experience the load shedding challenges because there isn't energy reaching their homes. So access to reliable energy for communities in Africa is a reality, and we're trying to figure out how to keep the lights on at all hours of the day for the folks who do have this energy infrastructure. I want to put a small caveat in place because I think too often we place the African continent in one lump sum, and it really isn't a fair justification of all the unique, diverse qualities. There's 54 countries in Africa, and this hour-long panel I will not have enough time to go into. I'm looking at this clock now, and I haven't even made my way into my main part, so I won't be able to talk about each regional part of the challenges and opportunities that the African continent faces in the energy challenge. So I wanted to go back to this theme of abundance. We've been really talking about abundance in this context of the US context of having so much abundance and just having to deregulate it to access this. But I think in the developing countries, particularly in Africa, they don't have the privilege of even accessing their abundant potential and are actually constrained by Western countries to tap into this potential to meet development and climate goals. You just said a figure. I have a different number of how many million people in Africa lack access to energy, but it's a lot. And while the 46% of the population who do have access to energy have it, they use less than all of Spain alone, which is insane. Picture Africa and then Spain. That's crazy. And the low usage of energy, partly due to the load shedding challenges, but also the folks who have access to energy also can't afford the energy that they have access to. So while Western countries are grappling with energy challenges, energy transition challenges, the global community has also prioritized the need to increase energy access in Africa. The Sustainable Development Goal number 7 is to increase access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. But the question is, how? How is this going to happen? In what form will the energy be? And who's going to finance it? The good news is that the African continent has both renewable and natural gas potential to serve its energy needs. There's also nuclear, but I'm not a nuclear person, so we'll wait for the nuclear guy to talk about nuclear. So discoveries of gas in Africa from 2010 to 2020 represented 40% of all gas discoveries worldwide, raising the continent's reserves to over 5 trillion cubic meters of undeveloped reserves. This places several African countries in the top 15 nations worldwide in terms of proven reserves. The continent also possesses incredible renewable energy potential. It has 60% of the world's best solar resources, however, has only tapped into 1% of its global installed capacity. And there's also wind and geothermal and hydro, but those two depend on the geological context of each of these countries. And so in recent years, this kind of goes to who's going to finance it. So in recent years, international institutions have voiced commitments to divest completely from fossil fuel infrastructure abroad. One example is the US Department of the Treasury's response to President Biden's Executive Order 14008, which is the Tackling the Climate Crisis Abroad, which ends support of direct investments in coal and oil projects abroad. And then the second example that comes to mind is the European Investment Bank's energy lending policy, which phased out support for energy projects reliant on unabated fossil fuels. So this has really ignited the debate over whether it's possible for countries in Africa experiencing high levels of energy poverty to leapfrog, they've been using this term leapfrog, the energy transition, and immediately transition to renewable power generation without fossil fuels. And this is a little problematic when countries in Africa are expected to decarbonize industrial and agricultural processes, which is something that countries like the U.S. and countries in the U.S. and countries in the EU are still struggling with how to fuel their industry processes on renewable energy at scale. And so this narrative has slightly changed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That happened several months ago, I guess. We're in, what month are we in now? October, it's been a while now. Europe, for example, is now looking to invest in LNG projects, in more LNG projects in Africa to meet its energy demands, which, for better or for worse, we'll get into this later, I'm sure. And then the White House released President Biden's Sub-Saharan Africa strategy over the summer, which Blinken delivered in Cape Town, or not in Cape Town, in South Africa. Maybe it was in Pretoria or Joburg, I don't know. I don't know the details, but two key points in the strategy that relates to energy stood out in his speech. It's that the U.S. is recommitting themselves to work with African countries and leaders to meet their specific needs, instead of the former approach in U.S. African policy, which has been to set the agenda for African leaders. And this is particularly notable because leaders of Malawi, Uganda, Senegal, and Nigeria have all publicly advocated for natural gas developments. No African country is planning to go the all gas route. So, so we'll see. I think the COP negotiations this year, they're terming it the African COP, will really see if the Biden administration will actually follow through on this of listening and working with African leaders to meet their needs. And then another notable part of the strategy is the administration's recognition of including gas-to-power infrastructure, which shows that the White House is acknowledging that gas shouldn't and cannot be a resource that Western countries are only allowed to benefit from. And then one other thing, and then I'll turn it over to you, but I want to also reference Todd Moss. He's where is he? Yeah, where is he? Yeah. He should be here. But if all of Africa's untapped gas is fully developed, these resources would barely raise Africa's contributions to global emissions. Todd Moss and Jacob Kinzer from the Energy for Growth Hub, which I assume many of you are familiar with, but if you're not, go give them a follow. Here's some, free promo for Energy for Growth Hub. They do really great timely analysis on this very topic. But they found that Africa's emissions would go from, if they used all of those untapped natural gas resources, it would increase Africa's contributions to global emissions from less than 3% to just 3.5%. And that's if they fully go all out in developing these natural gas projects, which isn't what the intention is. And to put it into context, the US contributes 28%. And then one more final fact is that under the IEA's Sustainable Africa Scenario, which they released over the summer as well, which was like a roadmap to net zero for Africa, 80% of Africa's primary generation will be derived from renewable resources. And then that natural gas will be used to fuel the continent's economic growth in the near term. So it's really like finding this happy balance between developing natural gas to fuel economic growth and support industrial production in Africa, while developing an enabling environment for mass renewable deployment in the long term. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Maya. Good overview. Go ahead, Robert.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the agricultural sector. And in that sector, the pulling up the ladder story is a bit more narrow. Those that are pulling up the ladder are primarily European greens. And the ladder that they're pulling up is leaving poor farmers in Africa with fewer choices to increase their productivity. The ladder that's being pulled up is science-based productivity growth in farming. And the irony here is that it was Europeans who invented this wonderful breakthrough. The father of plant breeding is Gregor Mendel. He spoke German. The inventors of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer were two German chemists, Haber and Bosch. European farmers used these breakthroughs in the 20th century to become highly productive and prosperous. But now, more recently, governments in Europe that used to be under the control of farm lobbies are increasingly influenced by green parties, and they're going, as a result, they're going in a different direction. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. One is the new European Union farm-to-fork strategy, which is a part of the European Green Deal that was unveiled in 2019. The centerpiece of this strategy is to increase organic farming in Europe from 8% of cropland today up to at least 25% of cropland by 2030, so tripling organic farming in a decade. This is not what European farmers want. They know that organic crop yields are, for field crops, 20 to 30% lower than conventional yields. They've seen all the modeling projections. They know that if this is actually done, output in Europe will fall maybe by 12 to 14%, and food prices for European consumers will increase from where they are now by another 17%. But this is popular with the environmental community in Europe, with Green Party leaders. Now, you wonder why this should be popular in light of the experience in Sri Lanka that Amanda mentioned. Sri Lanka decided to go organic. They terminated fertilizer imports. Rice yields fell 20%. Prices increased, and the government then fell. But this is what the Europeans want to do. In fact, a part of the farm-to-fork strategy is to use the trade and assistance programs of the EU to push this vision out into the developing world in order to speed what they call the ecological transition in the developing world. A second example of unhelpful advice from Europe is Europe's promotion of what's called agroecology. Agroecology is a system of farming that rejects the core components of the original Green Revolution. No purchased nitrogen fertilizer, use traditional seeds, not improved seeds, no powered machinery. The vision of agroecologists is to imitate nature, to don't disturb the environment, to work within the environment as much as possible. So you intercrop more than one kind of crop in a field. You use a lot of hand techniques, hand weeding, hand pruning. You build raised beds and repair those beds by hand. You tend animals so that the animals can be in and amongst the crops. These are techniques that can work very well at an NGO demonstration site, as long as there's plenty of hired labor around to do all this work. But farmers on their own farms don't want to spend all that time pruning and repairing raised beds and tending animals and mulching and harvesting by hand. So agroecology has not scaled up. It has not scaled up. It's been promoted for 30 years, but it has not scaled up. If you ask an agroecologist, well, why hasn't it scaled up? They'll say, well, it has scaled up. And they'll point to, they have a couple of favorite examples. Bhutan is one of them. A tiny little Himalayan kingdom. And yes, they still hand garden in Bhutan, but they import half of their food. And even with those imports, 1/3 of all children are stunted. The other favorite example is Cuba, which was pushed into an experiment with agroecology when the Soviet Union collapsed and they lost their access to subsidized energy and fertilizers. And agroecologists say, oh, Cuba's a success for agroecology, but Cuba's own data on production tell a very another story. Per capita food production in Cuba today is still 1/3 below where it was in 1990 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Cuba imports as much as 80% of its food, and still it doesn't have enough. In 2019, Cuba had to reimpose rationing for basic food supplies. But this has not deterred European Greens from promoting agroecology inside the UN system. And the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization now has a scaling up agroecology project that plans to, in the next 10 years, to extend what they call agroecological knowledge to 60 different countries around the world, and to increase training in the agroecology transition in 20 more countries. A third example that I can speak to just very quickly because it's more familiar is Europe's overregulation of genetically engineered crops. Now, this isn't really pulling up the ladder because Europe didn't even use this ladder itself. When genetically engineered crops became available, Europe was ready to go for it, but advocacy groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth scared European consumers away from these products. Popular opposition then forced governments to put very strict regulations on these crops, and so they've not been planted in farm fields in Europe. The problem is these same advocacy groups then persuaded governments in the developing world, especially Africa, to adopt the same regulations. So not just mandatory labeling, but also a tracing requirement that obliges all operators in the food chain to maintain an audit trail, a record of every GMO that they got and from whom and to whom it went and when for 5 years. This is a regulation that cannot be complied with. And so rather than attempt to do so, GMO crops are out of the fields and out of the markets in Africa as well. The new twist to this drama is goes back to the previous session. Gene editing emerged in 2015. Genome editing is not GMOs. It's not transgenic. There's no foreign DNA. Everyone hoped that this new technique would escape the kind of stifling regulation that GMOs have encountered in Europe. But then in 2018, the European Court, which is their Supreme Court, ruled that no, genome editing should be regulated just like GMOs with all of the stifling requirements. So the risk now is that gene editing won't go forward in Europe either. It will be difficult for the United States to go forward with genome editing and try to export crops to Europe, and perhaps the Africans are going to follow the Europeans again and embrace the same stifling regulatory system. And this additional breakthrough will be killed in the cradle for poor farmers in Africa. I'm out of time. I could say a little bit more in the question session about why Europeans are behaving this way rather than the way the United States behaves, and also what might be done about it.
Excellent. We'll come back to you on that. So, Shayak, what do you see out there?
Thank you, Amanda. My name is Shayak Sengupta. I'm from ORF America. We're a think tank based in Washington, and we focus on the United States, India, and their partners. So what I wanted to talk about was how U.S. policy makes it difficult for developing countries to deploy nuclear technology. And so when it comes to the global kind of civilian exports of nuclear tech, Russia and China are really major players, and Russia dominates the global market. And we know that nuclear is crucial to decarbonization, especially in developing countries where energy use will go up undoubtedly. And so the U.S. has really fallen behind Russia and China to make its exports attractive for primarily two reasons. One is just export control regulation. So if you're a private U.S. nuclear company and you're looking to export abroad, the regulatory regime to prevent proliferation is very complex. You have to go through 4 different agencies. It takes a lot of time. The other thing about the United States compared to Russia and China is that the U.S. doesn't offer package deals. So if you're a developing country that's looking to adopt nuclear tech, you're going to need the financing, the tech, kind of the fuel, everything, every part of the process. And Russia actually offers those in package deals that are at significant discount. If you want to work with the United States, you have to kind of go a la carte from company to company and organization to organization. So overall, as much as not as pulling up the ladder with the U.S. has it been just kind of an incoherence in policy or an absence of policy, and really, U.S. private companies can't compete with state-owned Chinese and Russian companies. And so, that was a very quick and dirty overview. There are folks in this room that have written about this and what to do about it. So what I wanted to focus on was this specific case study of India, and how you had this kind of weird mix of like the coherence of policy, but then kind of the absence of it afterwards. So overall, what we find is that the United States was instrumental in normalizing India's nuclear program, and however, since that happened in the 2000s, Russia has really had more influence on the sector and how it actually played out. So how did that work out? And so I'm going to give everyone a really quick history lesson. So in the 1960s, the United States began an Atoms for Peace program with India. So they provided technical assistance, training. They set up reactors, provided fuel. But after India refused to join the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and diverted some of that civilian technology for weapons tests in the early 70s, the U.S. said, no, we're going to cut all of this off, and the United States put sanctions on the country. And so, throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, India was really a nuclear pariah. It wasn't really allowed to conduct any kind of civilian nuclear trade, given these nuclear tests, and it developed a largely indigenous program. But by the late 90s, when India conducted more tests, the U.S. slacked more sanctions. And throughout this entire time, different countries kind of kept the program alive through exports of fuel, but Russia was really the largest player, most influential player throughout that kind of 30 to 40 years of being a pariah. So we're at the early 2000s, and the Bush administration and somewhat of the Clinton administration as well kind of makes a decision, hey, we're going to engage with India and try to strike a 1-2-3 agreement or a civilian nuclear deal to normalize the country's program. So negotiations go along, and the deal gets kind of inked in 2008. However, and that deal was really transformational, right? It not only opened up India's nuclear program to the world, the country was able to strike deals with a variety of U.S. allies to make sure it wasn't just this pariah on its own. But then also for U.S.-India ties, it was transformational. And since the 2000s, there's been ties in climate, energy, health, you name it. But the irony of it is that since 2008, more Russian reactors have come up, actually deployed, like turned on in India than American ones. And so, that's partly due to kind of a kink on the Indian side, and there's a weird, liability law that slowed negotiations down. But over the last 10 years, France and Russia have been able to strike deals and kind of get around that, and Russia was able to strike even more deals. So kind of bringing it back to U.S. policy and the takeaway from what we see is, there's been a lot of good ideas about, what can the U.S. do to engage with developing countries to make the nuclear tech attractive and get U.S. companies to export, and a lot of good ideas, right? And this case study of India kind of shows, hey, this is the kind of the coherence and the push and the will that you actually need from the top, from the White House down, to make this happen. And you had an amenable partner who was willing to kind of meet the U.S. halfway. But once that deal got signed in 2008, the U.S. government kind of just stepped back and decided, hey, this is up to the private sector and the Indian government to kind of figure out how to get more U.S. reactors deployed in the country. So I think we've seen that overall, again, the case study is a good example of like what we can, some good things, but then also the kind of the incoherence and kind of leading it out to the private sector and thinking that you can't have like robust kind of government engagement after deals are signed and treaties are inked.
Okay. So, we've had a couple of different examples of really incoherence. I think that's the word you're using,
Yeah.
and that is also the impression one gets across the different sectors in this space. Let me come back to you and ask, what would a better offer look like to developing country partners? Let's start with you, and then we can, how is it that we could use the existing international organizations, at least to do no harm?
Yeah, I think when it comes to just nuclear or just climate tech in general, we have a Development Finance Corporation that went through kind of a revamp. Todd is another plug for Todd, was instrumental in that. We have an Export-Import Bank. We have a U.S. Trade and Development Agency. So these are these smaller kind of agencies that we don't really think about. It's not the AIDs and the states, the State Department, they're going to be leading a lot of it, but is really using those agencies because that's what the Chinese and the Russians are doing. They're providing the tech, they're providing the finance, they're providing their own. They might be state-owned enterprises, and so we don't have as much of a link between our private sector and the government. But I think it's pretty it's safe to say that if the U.S. wants to kind of open up a market, it's really for U.S. businesses to invest and kind of take their share of the pie.
Okay. And Robert, what's your solution then on the European side for getting to a more virtuous politics? Starts at home, right?
Well, it's going to be very difficult. I wouldn't go through international organizations because, as you pointed out, the World Bank has already stepped back from its tradition of significant investments in infrastructure, including rural roads, dams, irrigation, for fear of being criticized by environmentalists, among other things. The FAO, which used to be a pro-green revolution organization, is now promoting agroecology, in part because European governments and European donors pay so much attention to the UN system that they tend to dominate. And since the 1990s, NGOs have now been on the inside in the UN system, and they're no longer on the outside now. They're on the inside. European, it's not a simple problem. Europe is very different from the United States. If you ask Americans, are you green or not? 37% say, yes, I'm green. If you ask the Italians, 59% say they're green. If you ask the French, 65% say they're green. If you ask Germans, 70% say they're green. There is a very different cultural attitude now toward, let's call it nature. And this compounds itself in Europe because they have a multi-party system that gives third, fourth, and fifth parties, including green parties, access to government. The United States doesn't have a green party to speak of. But in Europe today, 13 countries have green party members elected in the legislature, and 6 of them have green party members in government. This gives them enormous influence over public policy. And the problem in agriculture is, and this is an interesting point, the green parties in Europe have a legitimate complaint about agriculture in Europe. European farmers, because they were so long protected and given subsidies, over-apply chemicals. French farmers apply 34% more fertilizer per hectare than U.S. farmers. German farmers apply 60% more pesticides than U.S. farmers. The irony is, on a continent where farmers are not green, Europe is presenting a green deal to developing countries that, of course, what they want is to reduce chemical use. Right. But in their enthusiasm, they want to reduce it to 0, which is the organic standard. And then in their additional zeal, they want to extend that organic standard to developing countries. And organic groups in Europe, they see Africa as a real opportunity. Since farmers in Africa use almost no chemicals at all, it's very easy to get them certified as organic. So here we are. We're stuck in a terrible bind, and I don't know how you're going to change the culture in Europe.
And I mean, the other issue is that in sub-Saharan Africa, something like 80% of farmers are smallholder farmers that aren't very productive. Yes, they're hand farming, but it's really not the point for development, either in terms of growth or jobs or food security.
Yeah, most don't have fertilizers, most don't have irrigation, most don't have rural roads or storage, most don't have power, most don't have veterinary medicine for their animals. They're living in a perfect poverty trap. They don't have any of the things that farmers in the rest of the world have used to become productive and escape poverty. But it fits the image of agroecology.
That's what I meant, sort of this romantic sentimentalism about tilling the land and the community garden and all of that. It's a problem within the aid field as well.
And I could just add one thing to that as well. I my background, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia where I was working on sustainable agriculture, and it really opened up my eyes to like how challenging just everyday farming is for these smallholder farmers, and how it is nothing like what we picture here for farming. Like from sun up to sundown, you're working all day long to plant your crops and make sure that you and your family have food to take you through the rest of the year. And compounded by all of the climate change challenges of erratic rainfalls and unpredictable pest pressures and everything that goes into that group. But then you're also spending your days collecting firewood so that you can cook your meals, going to tap water at either your borehole or your or a well, whatever your community might have. And then on top of all of that, you just have to keep up with all the household chores so that your house isn't taken over by rats and pests. And so it's just, in this context, it's just crazy that there are all these regulations to keep these farmers from being able to be more productive. Africa has a quarter of the most arable lands, and they are 10%, they produce 10% of food, global food. And so there's all this potential, an incredible potential to be able to really increase food production, make smallholder farmer productivity more profitable too, and that's kind of where the energy can come in by having more cold storage and have milling processes so that folks can sell it at a higher, farmers can sell their products at a higher price if it's processed instead of at its raw value. But there's all these constraints that are just constantly, like what you said with the poverty trap, that just seems like there's, when Western countries are blocking energy investments, and then also constraining like what kind of fertilizers and chemicals they're able to use to be more productive and profitable. It's just, I know I don't want to keep talking about the Western hypocrisy, but I have to talk about it. It's incredibly hypocritical, and it's hard to sit here and talk about what should be done when it feels so challenging.
So, I mean, what could change with the politics going forward so that there is something that can approach rationality in the next years?
Yeah, so I think going back to the energy side, I'll leave the agriculture stuff to you, but I think for the U.S., the IRA does unlock some possibility to transfer this advanced technology at a lower cost, at a faster rate, to countries in Africa. So I think that's a huge opportunity, and I think I'm eager and interested to see how the IRA is able to work on improving transmission, because I think that'll be a really big challenge to increase transmission in Africa. And how to work with utility companies and producers, and then the end users as well, in making sure that we can avoid the load shedding challenges and avoid folks not even being able to afford the energy, even if the connection's in their backyard. Also in the U.S., the DFC, the Development Finance Corporations, also just recently approved, I think it was their biggest transaction, but you'd have to fact check me on that, but they just approved 62 transactions this quarter that totals more than $2.3 billion. And there were a few notable investments in agriculture in Africa, but also a few notable investments of clean energy in Africa as well. And so, for example, one is a $25 million loan to support a solar project, a 20 megawatt solar project in Malawi, and that also includes like a battery and energy storage project included in that. And then there's also $50 million in political risk insurance to support financing and distribution of high-quality, affordable, off-grid solar solutions in Nigeria. So it's more than just putting out the solar panels, right? It's having to find the political risk insurance too, to make sure that folks feel safe investing in these risky environments, or what seem to be risky. And then a $40 million direct investment in Energy Entrepreneurs Growth Fund to finance companies providing off-grid renewable energy solutions to across sub-Saharan Africa. So there's obviously some movements, and I think that DFC is just one small example of how the U.S. is staying involved in that. And then USAID's Power Africa, their goal is to add 30,000 megawatts and 60 million electricity connections in sub-Saharan Africa by 2030. And I think this would relate to your background as well, because one of their priorities is electrifying healthcare facilities. And so I think Power Africa is finding ways to prioritize where energy goes to when you have such a big population who needs energy, finding an avenue of delivering that, either if it's through healthcare or schools, to be able to prioritize that to improve lives and livelihoods. On the European side, I don't know what they I don't know what they should do. I think there's a challenge right now, since Europe is strapped for gas, as they're weaning themselves off of Russian gas, like how they're going to meet energy demand, especially this coming winter. So Europe is looking to invest in African LNG, and it's not anything like Africa already exports to Europe. They're just looking to do more. But Europe hasn't really shown interest in investing in downstream infrastructure in Africa. So it's going to be awfully hard to meet the SDG 7 if downstream infrastructure isn't being developed, if Europe isn't interested in that, and they're only interested in extracting, which is a colonial legacy that Africa is all too I don't want to say used to, but has experienced for too long as well.
I mean, it does create incentives for investment in infrastructure in like Nigeria, which is going to be shipping LNG into Europe, and that's probably a good thing. I mean, so Robert, you wrote off the multilateral development banks and the World Bank, but I do have to say, the scale, when we compare it to the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, or, it's so small what we're doing as a U.S. bilateral, whereas if we act in these multilateral development finance institutions, it's, billions and billions of dollars just for low-income countries. The IDA window, which is the concessional lending window of the World Bank, it's about $100 billion over a 3-year period. It's just a different order of magnitude, and that's not counting the regional development banks and things like that. So, and in fact, this week, Janet Yellen will be speaking at the Center for Global Development on Thursday, and she'll be talking about the U.S. vision for a new World Bank, we hope, a climate bank. And I guess the question for you is, what would we like to see from something like that would be different? Would you hold out optimism given this shift to thinking about green banks and climate banks? I know that the IRA set up a green bank here in the United States. It's interesting. I'm not sure how many parallels there are, but what are your thoughts on that?
If I were an African, I would put my money on China. China has taken a deep interest in agriculture in Africa, going all the way back to 2000 when they had a forum in Beijing on Chinese-African agricultural cooperation. And China's strategy has been, they're not promoting organic farming. They have set up in 25 different African countries centers for agricultural technology development and demonstration. And they work through local universities, through the government. They bring in Chinese bankers and Chinese expats. They try to do too much themselves, and too much of the money that goes in is loaned, and it can create debt problems for borrowing countries, including Sri Lanka. That's one reason that they didn't have the money to import fertilizer. They rung up a big debt with the Chinese. But the Chinese, the estimate I've seen is that they annually, through loans and investments, put $13 billion into the agricultural sectors alone in Africa. They do that to ingratiate themselves with African governments, but also to create the infrastructure for future trade relationships, both agricultural goods going out and Chinese goods going back in. I mean, they want to import poultry from Kenya. So they create the infrastructure for a poultry industry. And if I were a Kenyan, I'd say, hey, that's a lot better than being scolded by the World Bank for too many greenhouse gas emissions, or by the Americans for not enough democracy. The Chinese have rules that are a little too lax on some of those things, but they put up the money. They promote technology-forward solutions, and it creates for Africans choices they didn't have when they just had to wait for the Western donor community to negotiate among itself about the various litmus tests the borrowers would have to pass. One other thing I've got to say about the Chinese, and this goes back to our biotechnology arguments. China followed Europe the first time around with GMOs. China has not approved, even though they've developed and they have it ready, they've not approved any GMO rice or any GMO wheat. They're on the verge of approving GMO maize, but they haven't quite done it yet for commercial cultivation. But China has been full speed ahead with genome editing. China has published twice as many papers on the use of CRISPR in agriculture as U.S. scientists. They have more patents than U.S. scientists for CRISPR in agriculture. And earlier this year, they signaled that their regulatory approach to gene editing is going to be different from GMOs. If there isn't any foreign DNA in the edited plant, it's not going to be regulated like a GMO. So my guess is if China goes down this path, that will create more space for other developing countries to decouple gene editing from GMO phobias and embrace gene editing as well. Maybe even Africans will be able to decouple themselves from their post-colonial deference to Europe and follow China instead. And in the long run, maybe this will leave the European standards so isolated in the world that they'll have to find a way to get out of it. And maybe they'll relitigate the gene editing issue and break away from the GMO regulation system.
If I could add to that, I think the common thread through all of this is doing your homework, right? So I think the West kind of, and our recent political climate here has gotten, pendulum back and forth, right? But I think, a lot of the time when Western countries kind of go in and say, hey, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, they don't do their the homework about history matters, and then, there's basic facts. So, again, we use the refrigerator example, right? But just having these basic facts of, per capita energy consumption is an order of magnitude lower in many of these countries. It sounds like a broken record, but I think so many of developing countries, and India has tried to take on a mantle on this, especially with this stuff in Ukraine, is, just repeating the same basic facts over and over and over again. And, I don't know if, it might be falling on deaf ears, but just like making sure everyone's back on the same page. Because I think shiny objects can be distractions, so.
I'm going to come back and ask you about the COP26 process, which I read somewhere it was going to be the African COP. I mean, I don't know if that's a joke or not, but we'll come back to that. But just on Chinese developed finance for these things, I mean, there are 62 countries now in debt distress because of Chinese debt or parastatal debt. There has been a drop in Chinese finance into sub-Saharan Africa over the last years due to the crisis there. So there is a kind of opportunity if we were able to pivot and reframe some of the offer that's on the table. I think that's worth considering. And not that everything has to be seen in a competitive sense, but I think it's also quite encouraging what you're saying about how Chinese policy, or a more enlightened policy on some issues, could be influential in other parts of the world in a very positive way. I don't know that they've necessarily talked about policy as part of their package that's on offer, but rather, they've just focused on infrastructure, but it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Let's turn to COP26. I mean, is it the African COP? What deal, we've heard some good language come out of the Biden administration on this that is I guess the earlier plenary called it the all of the above approach to energy and energy poverty, how that fits with climate, that it's a full menu of things on the table. But the Europeans don't seem inclined to move far on this. I haven't heard the same kinds of words from the U.S. climate envoy. What's your outlook on that, Maya?
Yeah, so they have been terming it the African COP, and I think it's the first COP that's held in the African continent in over a decade. And so last year at COP, the African leaders left COP feeling, and not feeling like not having their needs addressed. And so I think there's hope that this COP will be prioritizing the African needs more than it was prioritized last year. And I'm wondering if things will be overshadowed, if African needs will be overshadowed due to Russia's war in Ukraine. I think I agree that the envoy's office hasn't come out to state exactly what their approach is to prioritize the African COP. I know that there's been some, Secretary Kerry made a remark saying that the climate doesn't care where the emissions come from, and there's been a strong push from African countries for loss and damages, because the African communities are going to be facing the worst consequences of climate change, and it's already being felt, and they have the least amount of resources to adapt to those changes, and and they've contributed the least amount to it. So I don't have a clear answer for you. I think it'll be a waiting game to see what the negotiations look like after COP, and so we'll have to redo this panel after that.
That's right, we'll come back. Do you have other thoughts?
I'd be interested to see how the U.S. kind of touts the IRA globally. I know it was a very domestic piece of legislation, and there are enough challenges and kind of things to do ahead of time at home to make sure that thing is implemented. But there has been kind of thinking of how do we kind of maximize the returns of the IRA, and I think you'll kind of, I'm skeptical of you don't want this pitfall of the same thing happened where we kind of invested all this money at home, and then we just decided to kind of wall ourselves off, and then someone else kind of fills that space when it comes to making sure that the investments we make at home actually get abroad, because there's money to be made, right? It's not just a kind of altruistic, we're going to give this stuff away, but and I think the thinking on that is slowly growing. But yeah, I'd be interested to see how the U.S. kind of touts IRA as a global piece of legislation.
And I also think another thing to keep an eye out for this COP is where climate financing goes. There's obviously a great deficit in meeting the 100 billion per year that was committed almost a decade ago, maybe. And so the Just Energy Transition Partnership that South Africa was the first to negotiate last year. The investment plan should be coming out soon, so we can see what, and it's definitely just a drop in the bucket for what South Africa really needs big picture. But what I learned last week in South Africa was that the folks in the Presidential Climate Commission was saying that this is triggering the transition and supporting it. And they were already planning on doing it, but decommissioning their coal. But this definitely helps get the ball rolling on this transition. So I know that Senegal is also looking for a partnership like that, and then beyond Africa, Indonesia and Vietnam are also in the process of negotiation. So it'll be interesting to see what that means and what it really means for why G7 countries are changing climate finance to reflect more of these partnerships, and if it's maybe a distraction from the 100 billion, or if it's actually more of an effective way to finance the energy transition. So more to come on that, I'm sure.
Yeah, and Todd's not here, but Todd and Jude Moore, who's my other colleague who works on this, are skeptical about the capacity of the G7 to really deliver financing on the terms and for the duration that it's needed.
Right.
I am more optimistic that, in a fantasy world, perhaps the MDBs could put those kinds of new terms and conditions up for this kind of long-term financing. But go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be more confident if I could trust the donor governments to make financing available for adaptation. Mm-hmm. And I'd be more confident if I could trust African governments to use those funds to make vulnerable communities, fishing communities on the coast facing sea level rise, farming communities facing droughts and floods, make them more resilient rather than using the money for some other purpose. There's not a history of this money being given properly or used wisely.
That's a whole nother panel too. We could have a whole conversation on that. So we have 4 minutes left. So I guess a question for our BTI friends is, should we go to the audience for questions and comments? Does that make sense?
Thanks, Amanda. We'll do one more round of this. We'll try and take 2 or 3 questions at a time. So if anyone has a question for the panel, we've got another 15 or 20 minutes for that. See a couple over here.
I'm as slow.
Earl Ellis, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I thought it was interesting. It's like parallel thinking. This idea that the Chinese vision for development in Africa is a development vision that's guided by a country that pulled itself out of poverty through successful agricultural development, and they understand the needs of these other countries. And the question that always comes back when you see this, because it really does seem like the Chinese are changing the game, and it is going to pull Africa out of poverty and build all this infrastructure. The kind of what could go wrong? What's the bad side of all that?
Will Tobin from the Atlantic Council. So forgive me in advance, but I'm going to dump my most top-level question on Africa onto this panel. So across this incredibly diverse continent, it seems like there's a bit of a chicken and egg cycle for closing that financing gap. It seems like there's people who want to invest in infrastructure and people who want to invest in projects, but those projects aren't viable unless there's infrastructure. So how do we reconcile that? How do we break that chicken and egg cycle?
Should we go back to the panel then? What could go wrong with the very high level of Chinese finance and cooperation in sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, I think one thing that we're already seeing, which is debt distress, that's one big issue. And kind of ad hoc approach to refinancing or debt forgiveness, because it's not Paris Club anymore. It's an ad hoc, country-by-country approach. And then, of course, they're an authoritarian government, so they have other kinds of norms and things that liberal societies don't like. But, what do you think, Robert?
Yeah,
You've put it out there.
That's a good answer. But I just have to note that China, as an authoritarian government, managed to lift more people out of poverty quickly after 1985 than any other government in history. So the West maybe should back off a little bit. We say, okay, governance is important, but instead of measuring the quality of governance in terms of the type of government that's in place, maybe we should focus more on the deeds of government, the investments that governments make, and the beneficiaries of those investments. I cut China a little more slack than most other people, I admit. On the question of infrastructure and the chicken and egg problem, I agree completely with that. And it's not just projects that need infrastructure, it's private sector investments that need infrastructure. Private companies don't go in if public goods are not provided, if they don't have roads, if they don't have power, if they don't have rule of law, if they don't have any of those basic, they're not going to pay for those things themselves. Yeah, they'll buy a generator for their office. They're not going to provide a power grid. If those things don't exist, private investment doesn't go in. And that's the story in Africa. Very little foreign direct investment goes into Africa because the public goods have not been provided by African governments themselves. And those African governments have also, I'm going to be critical of African governments, they've neglected agriculture. 60% of their citizens are living in the countryside. They depend on farming and herding animals for income and employment. And yet most African governments invest only about 5% of their public budget in any kind of agriculture. The people in the countryside are politically weak. Women and children. Women may be politically disorganized. They may be illiterate. They're divided against one another by ethnicity. They're not aware of what's going on in the capital city. They're not armed. These people are easy to ignore from the capital. In the capital, you pay attention to the army, pay attention to the industrialists, the students, the bureaucracy, These are people who can take to the streets and get rid of you. So African investments are urban biased, and agriculture loses out. And until we can correct that, it'll be very, very difficult to get projects going, or even to get or private sector investments going.
Jack, do you have thoughts on?
I mean, I think the debt trap kind of diplomacy that's been kind of in common parlance is, I think, a risk. But you know, I think I heard this at a panel in Washington where this was a person in Kenya, and you know, they said, hey, but the Chinese are paying for all these highways and all this, and it's like, well, the alternative is no highway, right? So I think to what's been said before of it's again providing that choice, providing that abundance, and if that means it might be unfavorable financing long term, I think it's still, you know, there's a time value of money, right? So it's better to get something now than in the future.
Maya?
I don't think I have anything new or novel to add about about what could go wrong with China's influence. And then, Will, to answer your question, Will's my colleague. My plan was if anybody asked a hard question, I would just turn it over to Will, and this would be a time that I would turn over to Will. I think as lame as it sounds, I think that the chicken and egg solution or problem will really need to be addressed through public-private partnerships and find ways to accelerate those on the ground.
I mean, but I think part of the issue is that there's just not enough demand in these markets to really provide the returns on the other end of the investments. And so a question is, okay, well, like how much subsidy from the outside comes in? And then, you know, I think this idea of Europe buying power from sub-Saharan Africa is a very interesting development. So I think, you know, creating that demand is really the key. I mean, there's a big move in my own field on, you know, medical manufacturing and biotech in the region. And lots of interest in doing it for health security reasons. But if no one orders another COVID-19 vaccine from Aspen Pharma in South Africa, no industry is going to survive like that. And so I think, you know, thinking about really what is the demand side on some of these pieces and the expected return is part of the equation. Other questions or comments over there?
Seaver Wang, I'm from the Breakthrough Institute. So to circle back to a point that was raised in the last panel, which is sometimes green groups not speaking for the groups that they actually claim to represent, it seems to me like on all of these topics, energy, agriculture, nuclear power, this is blatantly apparent. And my question is this a way to sort of chip away at the power of green groups in contexts such as Europe to sort of to highlight the fact that this sort of ideological agenda is completely misaligned with the peoples that they're claiming to speak for?
Hey, Richard Morrison, CEI. When it comes to the ag part of sub-Saharan African farmers not having access to GM crops because the multilateral donors are now captured by green sort of, you know, ecology, ideology. Do you think there's a space for the big private foundations to come in and say, well, Bill and Melinda Gates are spending $1 billion on malaria mitigation or eradication. We're also going to spend $1 billion on setting up GM farms for you know, BT cotton in Zimbabwe at the same time.
So, yeah, let's start.
On Seaver's question, I think, you know, India is such a large country. It has a fairly robust civil society that it's, I think, fairly insulated from the types of things you see in Europe. That doesn't mean, you know, I'll hear some kind of batshit things sometimes. But for the most part, I think, you know, the United States also started the Green Revolution in India too, right? So, you know, there's an openness. Fertilizers are a thing, but, you know, yeah, I don't really see them having that much influence there.
But I was just like watching the conversation on the last plenary about community groups. It's sort of the same kinds of issues, you know. Which of these civil society groups represents the public interest, right? Which would be about looking at the costs and benefits of adopting a new technology, attending to the costs and the risks. But, you know, if the scales are really that it's a huge benefit, that there, you know, some imaginary optimizing policymaker would make that investment, right? So I mean, maybe I sort of like the idea of foundations showing proof of concept, and also financing groups that reflect the diversity of opinions and evidence around the public interest, the economics of the public interest on this. I don't think that the World Bank itself is captured, but I think it's the board of directors that sits there, and when a project comes up for hydro, or they don't even get there anymore because the chilling effect is so extreme. But like, say there is a new climate-based World Bank, they do a ton on climate, but could they also be doing these things better and attending to the concerns of environmental groups without sort of giving away the huge potential gains? I mean, I sort of feel like it's feasible if there was a better ecosystem around it, and in some ways, think tanks are part of that ecosystem, so we should be thinking ourselves what we should be doing differently. Do you have thoughts on that, Robert?
Yeah, on the question of green groups representing who, the Green Party in Germany represents Germans very well, because 80% of Germans want to be green. And being critical of European agriculture in Europe makes a certain amount of green sense. Europe is so much more densely populated than the United States, like 3 times as densely populated. So you can't hide agriculture away somewhere out in Iowa. It's right there. And so if they use too many chemicals, it's in your streams. It's in your yard. You can smell the pigs from your lawn. So green groups in Germany want to correct that, and I say good. It's only when they start to chase after a fantasy alternative, which is no chemical use at all, and then try to export that fantasy to countries that need to be using more chemicals, that's where the malfunction occurs. On the question of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, when they launched the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa back in 2006, the person they chose to head it up, Kofi Annan, surprised them by saying at the announcement ceremony, we're not going to do any GMOs in Africa. And they haven't. The question now, and I'll be watching this, and a lot of others will be watching this, now that we have genome-edited CRISPR crops coming through the pipeline, will AGRA, which is still in business, will they extend that prohibition beyond GMOs to gene-edited crops or not? That's going to be a tough choice for them. I hope they extend it. I hope they don't extend it. I hope they start supporting gene-edited crop development in Africa.
Did you read Bill Gates's climate book? No, me neither. You'll read it, and we'll come back and answer this question. Other thoughts, Maya?
I feel like it was all pretty much covered. Yeah, no remarkable thoughts on my end.
I see the zeros in front of us. So thanking the panelists for a great conversation, and thank you for the good questions. Thank you.